For something that seems so simple, fish and chips is prepared wrongly in most Britons' homes, and most people don't even realise it. It's not usually one obvious mistake. It's a series of small decisions that quietly change the outcome. On the surface, it still looks fine, and that makes it feel like everything is going the way it should. But the result isn't what it should be when you compare it to how it's done properly. So in this video, we're breaking down the biggest mistakes every Briton makes when cooking fish and chips and showing you how this should actually be done to get that proper result. Light batter, crisp coating, and chips that come out right. Stay till the end and you'll see exactly what needs to change. Mistake 8, losing control of the oil. For most people, cooking fish and chips starts by pouring oil into a pan or fryer, putting it on the hob and waiting for it to heat up. But what matters here isn't just heating oil, it's what oil you're using and how hot it is when you start. The best oils for this are oils that can handle high heat without breaking down. In most British kitchens, that means vegetable oil, sunflower oil, or groundnut oil. These stay stable at frying temperatures and don't overpower the flavour. Using something like olive oil or butter changes things immediately. They can't handle high heat properly. The moment the temperature rises, they start to smoke, darken, and affect the taste before the food has even cooked. Then comes the temperature. When you're starting, the oil should be around 170 to 180 degrees Celsius. And that's the point where the oil is hot enough to cook properly, but still controlled. Most people don't measure this. They rely on guesswork. The oil looks hot, so the fish or chips go in. If the oil is too cold at that moment, the batter doesn't set. Instead of forming a crisp coating, it absorbs oil. The fish turns greasy, the coating feels heavy, and the chips soften instead of crisping. If the oil is too hot, the opposite happens. The outside cooks too quickly. The batter browns fast, sometimes before the fish inside has had time to cook through. It can look ready on the outside, but the texture inside tells a different story. This is why fish and chips often feel inconsistent at home. One time it's soggy, another time it's overdone. Even though the same steps were followed, there are also small signs people miss. Oil that's ready shouldn't be smoking heavily. It should look clear and steady, not dark or hazy. When a small drop of batter goes in, it should sizzle gently and rise, not sink and sit there, and not explode aggressively either. Once the oil goes past the right point, everything becomes harder to control. The batter won't behave the way it should. The chips won't cook evenly, and the flavour starts to change without people realising why. At that stage, it's not just cooking anymore, it's reacting to unstable conditions. And even if the oil is handled correctly, many people still run into problems before the fish even reaches it, because of what's happening on the surface of the fish itself. Mistake 7. Dropping wet fish straight into batter. Before the fish even gets close to the oil, most of the problems have already started. And in many kitchens, the process is quick and automatic. The fish comes out of the fridge, it's unwrapped, and it goes straight into the batter. Sometimes it's slightly damp from the packaging. Sometimes it's been rinsed under the tap and left to drip for a few seconds. It doesn't feel like a problem. After all, it's about to be covered in batter and fried. But that thin layer of moisture sitting on the surface of the fish changes how everything behaves from that point forward. Batter needs something dry to hold on to. When the surface of the fish is wet, the batter doesn't grip properly. Instead of sticking firmly, it sits loosely on top. In some areas it slides, in others it thins out. You still see a coating, so it looks like it's worked, but it hasn't attached the way it should. And that difference becomes obvious the moment the fish goes into hot oil. As soon as the fish hits the oil, the heat reacts with that surface moisture. The water turns into steam almost instantly. And that steam doesn't just disappear, it pushes outward right between the fish and the batter. So instead of the batter setting tightly around the fish, it starts to lift in places. This is where you begin to see the problems. The coating bubbles unevenly instead of forming a smooth shell. Some parts look thicker, while others look thin or patchy. In certain spots, the batter pulls away completely, exposing the fish underneath. At first glance, it still looks like frying. There's movement, there's bubbling, there's colour forming, but the structure isn't right. A properly coated piece of fish should develop a consistent outer shell. The batter should wrap around the fish evenly, seal it, and hold its shape while it cooks. When the fish is wet, that seal never fully forms. There's also what happens inside the fish itself. Because the coating isn't properly attached, heat doesn't move through the fish evenly. Some areas are protected by thicker batter, while others are exposed. This leads to uneven cooking. When you break into it, instead of clean, firm flakes, the texture can feel slightly off. Not undercooked, but not quite right either. This is why two pieces cooked in the same oil can come out completely different. One looks full and crisp, the other looks patchy, uneven, and slightly soft in places. And most people don't trace it back to this moment. They assume it's the oil, the batter, or even the fish itself. But the issue started before any of that. And fixing it is simple, but it requires attention. The fish should be completely dry on the surface before it goes into the batter. That means taking a few seconds with kitchen paper and pressing gently along the fish to remove any moisture. Not just the top, the sides as well. Once the surface is dry, the batter has something to grip onto. It spreads evenly, holds its shape, and stays attached when it hits the oil. Some cooks go a step further and lightly dust the fish with flour before dipping it into the batter. That creates a dry base layer, which helps the batter cling even more securely. That one step changes how the coating behaves from the moment it enters the oil. Without it, the batter is always fighting against moisture, and once that fight starts, you never quite get the clean, crisp finish you're expecting. And the next issue often comes from the batter itself, because small mistakes there can completely change how it cooks. Mistake 6. Getting the batter wrong without realizing it. If you watch how fish is coated in a proper chip shop, the difference shows up immediately. The batter isn't rushed, it isn't guessed, and it's not just mixed and used straight away. At home, it's usually the opposite. Flour goes into a bowl, liquid is added, it's stirred until it looks smooth, and then the fish goes straight in. As long as it sticks, it feels like the job is done. But that's where things quietly go off. In a standard chippy setup, the batter is controlled. The consistency is deliberate. It's not too thick, not too runny, and it's made to coat the fish evenly without sliding off. When batter is too thick at home, it creates a heavy layer around the fish. It fries on the outside, but underneath it stays dense. Instead of that light, crisp shell, you get something that feels bulky and slightly doughy when you bite into it. If it's too thin, it doesn't hold at all. It runs off the fish before it even reaches the oil, leaving patches exposed. That's why some pieces come out with uneven coating or barely any structure on the outside. Professional kitchens avoid this by keeping the batter at a consistency that clings but doesn't drip excessively. When the fish is lifted, the coating stays in place and settles evenly before it hits the oil. Temperature also plays a part here, even though most people don't think about it. In many chip shops, the batter is kept slightly cool. That contrast between cool batter and hot oil helps it set quickly, so forming that crisp outer layer almost immediately. At home, batter is often warm and used straight after mixing. When that goes into hot oil, it spreads more than it should and doesn't form the same clean structure. There's also how it's mixed. It might seem like mixing it until perfectly smooth is the right approach, but overmixing tightens the batter. It develops more structure than it needs, which leads to a coating that feels heavier instead of light. Batter is supposed to be mixed just enough to bring it together. It's not overworked. That's what helps it stay light when it fries. Then there's timing. In a proper setup, batter isn't always used immediately after mixing. It's allowed to settle slightly so everything stabilizes. That small pause makes a difference in how it coats and how it cooks. At home, this step is usually skipped, and the batter goes from bowl to fish to oil in one quick motion. And again, it still works. It still fries. It still looks like fish and chips, but the texture tells the real story. Instead of a light, crisp coating that holds its shape, you get something that feels heavier, uneven, or slightly off, even if you can't immediately explain why. That's the difference between batter that's just mixed and batter that's properly controlled. Even when the batter is right, the next issue often comes from what happens once everything goes into the oil, because adding too much at once changes the entire cooking environment. Mistake 5. Cooking too much at once. This is where a lot of people undo everything they've done right up to this point. The oil is hot, the batter is ready, the fish is coated properly, and then everything goes into the pan or fryer at once. It feels efficient, especially when you're cooking for more than one person, because it seems like the quickest way to get everything done. But the moment too much fish or too many chips hit the oil together, something changes immediately. The temperature drops. It doesn't look dramatic and most people don't notice it. The oil is still bubbling, there's still movement, and it feels like everything is cooking the way it should. But underneath that, the frying process has already shifted. Instead of frying, the food starts to steam. When oil is at the right temperature, it seals the outside quickly. That's what creates the crisp coating on the fish and the firm outer layer on the chips. But when too much goes in at once, the oil loses that heat and can't recover fast enough. So instead of sealing, it sits in that lower range where moisture begins to build. That's why the batter softens instead of crisping. It starts absorbing oil instead of locking it out, and the coating ends up feeling heavier and slightly soggy. The chips react the same way. Instead of crisping, they sit in oil that isn't hot enough to firm them up properly. They cook, but they don't develop that proper outer texture, so you end up with chips that feel soft or slightly oily, even if the colour looks right. Fish and chips is meant to be cooked in batches with space between each piece, and the oil is given time to recover before the next batch goes in. That's what keeps the temperature stable and the results consistent. At home, that step is usually skipped. Everything goes in together, and from that point on, you're working against the oil instead of with it. What makes this mistake difficult to notice is that it still looks like everything is working. The oil is bubbling, the food is cooking, and the colour develops. But the texture never quite lands where it should. If you've ever had fish that looks right but feels slightly soft, or chips that don't quite crisp no matter how long you leave them, this is usually where it started. If this is already making you rethink how you cook yours at home, take a second to like and subscribe. It helps the channel and it means we can keep breaking down everyday cooking habits like this in a way that actually makes a difference. Because even when you fix how much goes into the oil, there's another issue that starts much earlier, and it comes down to the potatoes themselves. Mistake 4, treating all potatoes the same. This is one of those parts people don't pay much attention to because a potato is a potato in most people's eyes. You peel it, cut it, drop it into oil, and expect chips to come out the way they should. But potatoes don't all behave the same once they hit hot oil. Some hold a lot more water than others, and that water has to go somewhere during cooking. When chips made from high moisture potatoes go into the fryer, that water starts turning into steam. Instead of the outside firming up quickly, the surface stays soft for longer, and that delays the crisping process. That's why chips can come out pale, soft, or slightly limp, even when they've been left in the oil long enough. They're cooking, but they're not drying out the way they need to before they can crisp. Potatoes should be chosen for how they behave when fried, not just how they look raw. Varieties like Maris Piper or King Edward are commonly used because they have the right balance of starch and moisture. They hold their shape, cook through properly, and allow the outside to crisp without collapsing. At home, this step is often skipped completely. Whatever potatoes are available get used, whether they're better suited for boiling, roasting, or something else entirely. The result is chips that don't behave consistently from one attempt to the next. There's also how the potatoes are prepared before they even reach the oil. After cutting, potatoes release surface starch. If that starch isn't rinsed off, it forms a coating on the outside of the chips. When those chips go into the oil, that layer interferes with how the surface cooks. Instead of crisping cleanly, it can create a slightly sticky or uneven texture. That's why in proper setups, cut chips are often rinsed and then dried before frying. Removing that excess starch and surface moisture helps the chips cook more evenly and develop a better outer layer. Skipping that step doesn't stop the chips from cooking, but it changes how they turn out. They can stick together, cook unevenly, or fail to develop that proper crisp edge people expect. What makes this mistake easy to miss is that the chips still look like chips. They brown, they soften inside, and they seem edible. But when you compare them to properly prepared chips, the difference shows up in both texture and consistency. Instead of a crisp outside and soft center, You get something that sits in between, not quite firm, not quite soft, and never fully satisfying. Many people still miss the next step that actually brings everything together: how the chips are cooked in stages. Mistake 3. Skipping the 2-stage cooking for chips. This is where chips either come together properly or fall short, even when everything before it has been done right. Most people cook chips in one go. They cut the potatoes, heat the oil, and leave the chips in until they look ready. Once they turn golden, they come out, and that's it. It feels logical. Cook them until they're done. But chips don't work that way. A proper chip has 2 parts to it. The inside should be soft and fully cooked, while the outside should be firm and crisp. Those 2 things don't happen at the same time, and trying to force them in one step is where the problem begins. When chips are cooked in one go, while the outside starts reacting first, it begins to colour and firm up while the inside is still cooking through. To compensate, people leave them in the oil longer, hoping everything balances out. What usually happens instead is that the outside keeps darkening while the inside catches up slowly. By the time the centre is fully cooked, the outer layer has often gone too far. That's why some chips come out looking right but feel slightly hard on the outside, or why others stay soft because they were taken out too early to avoid overcooking. In a proper chip shop, this is handled differently. Chips are cooked in 2 stages. The first stage is done at a slightly lower temperature, around 130 to 150 degrees Celsius. This is where the inside cooks through gently. The chips soften. The structure forms. But there's very little colour at this point. They're then taken out and allowed to rest briefly, just long enough for the surface to settle. After that, they go back into hotter oil, around 170 to 180 degrees Celsius, for a second cook. This is where the outside crisps up and develops that golden colour. Because the inside is already cooked, the second stage focuses entirely on texture. That separation is what creates the balance people expect. At home, this step is often skipped. Everything is done in one continuous cook, and from that point on, it becomes difficult to control both the inside and outside at the same time. You're either pulling them out too early and getting soft chips, or leaving them in too long and ending up with something overly firm or dry. What makes this mistake easy to overlook is that chips still come out looking acceptable. They have colour, they feel cooked, and they go on the plate without much thought. But when you compare them to properly cooked chips, the difference is clear. The texture isn't quite there. The outside doesn't have that clean crispness, and the inside doesn't feel as soft and structured as it should. At that point, most people assume they've done everything right and that the result is just how chips turn out at home. But there's another factor that can quietly interfere with the process while you're cooking, and it's something most people don't even notice happening in the pan. Mistake 2. Letting moisture build up. During cooking. There's a point during cooking where everything looks like it's working, but something subtle starts to go wrong. When the oil is bubbling, the fish is frying, the chips are in, and from the outside it feels like everything is under control. But inside the pan, moisture is building up. It doesn't come from one place, it comes from several. The fish releases moisture as it cooks. The chips release water from inside the potato. Even the batter can trap small amounts of steam as it reacts to the heat. All of that moisture has to go somewhere. When the oil is hot and stable, it pushes that moisture away quickly. That's what allows the surface of the fish and chips to dry out and crisp properly. But when moisture builds faster than the oil can handle, the environment changes. Instead of a dry, high-heat surface, you now have steam rising around the food, and steam doesn't crisp. This is where things begin to shift without people noticing. And the coating on the fish, which should be firm and crisp, starts to soften slightly. It still holds its shape, but it loses that sharp texture. The chips do the same. Instead of firming up, they sit in that damp heat and struggle to develop a proper outer layer. This is why food can look right but feel slightly off when you eat it. You might notice the coating isn't as crisp as expected, or the chips feel soft even though they've been in the oil long enough. The problem isn't always the cooking time, it's the conditions around the food while it's cooking. In a proper chip shop, this is controlled without people realizing it. The oil is kept at a steady temperature, batches are spaced out, and there's enough room in the fryer for moisture to escape quickly. At home, everything is happening in a smaller space. The pan is tighter, and more food goes in at once, and there's less room for that moisture to clear, so it builds. What makes this mistake difficult to spot is that it doesn't stop the cooking process. The fish still fries. The chips still cook. There's still color and movement, but the texture is slowly being affected the entire time. And once that moisture interferes with the surface, it becomes very difficult to get that clean, crisp finish back, no matter how long you leave it in the oil. Even if everything looks fine when it comes out, the difference shows the moment you bite into it. And this is where a lot of people start making adjustments, turning the heat up, leaving things in longer, trying to fix what they're seeing without realizing the issue started earlier. By the time they do that, the process is already off balance. Which brings us to the final mistake, the one that sits behind most of the others and ties everything together. Mistake 1. Rushing a process that needs timing. If you step back and look at everything we've covered, there's a common thread running through all of it. Speed. Fish and chips are often treated like something that should be done quickly. The oil is heated fast, the fish goes straight in, the chips are pushed through in one go, and everything is rushed to get it on the plate. It feels practical, it feels efficient, and because the food still comes out looking roughly right, it's easy to assume that approach works. But fish and chips don't respond well to being rushed. Every part of the process depends on timing. The oil needs time to reach the right temperature and stabilize. The fish needs to be prepared properly before it even touches the batter. The batter needs a moment to settle. The chips need to cook in stages, not all at once. When those steps are compressed or skipped, the process starts to overlap in ways it shouldn't. The oil hasn't fully stabilized, but the fish is already in. The batter hasn't settled, but it's already frying. The chips haven't finished their first stage, but they're being pushed to brown. That's when things begin to clash. The batter reacts too quickly or too slowly. The fish cooks unevenly. The chips don't develop the right texture, and instead of one controlled process, everything starts working against everything else. This is why people often feel like fish and chips are unpredictable at home. One attempt turns out decent, another feels slightly off, and another doesn't come together at all, even when the same ingredients are used. It isn't random. It's the result of rushing steps that depend on control. In a proper chip shop, nothing is actually rushed, even though it looks fast. Each stage is controlled. The oil is kept stable, the batches are timed, and everything is allowed to do what it's supposed to do before moving to the next step. That's why the result feels consistent. At home, the pace is usually different. Everything is pushed forward too quickly, and once that happens, it becomes difficult to recover the process. What makes this mistake important is that it sits behind most of the others. The wrong oil temperature often comes from rushing the heat. Wet fish goes into batter because there's no pause to prepare it properly. Where chips are cooked in one go because it feels faster. Too much food goes into the pan because you want it finished in one batch. It all traces back to the same habit, trying to speed up something that works best when it's controlled. Once that changes, everything else becomes easier to manage. The oil behaves the way it should, the batter sets properly, the fish cooks evenly. The chips finally reach that balance between crisp and soft. And at that point, fish and chips stop feeling inconsistent. They start coming out the way they're supposed to. If this helped you see where things have been going wrong in your own kitchen, let me know in the comments what part stood out most or what you've been doing differently. And if you want more breakdowns like this, where we take everyday meals and show you what's actually happening behind the scenes, take a second to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.